J. Paul Getty once stood in front of a payphone in his mansion, fishing for a dime while his grandson was being held for ransom in Italy. The richest private citizen in America refused to pay. That single decision would define not just a kidnapping crisis, but the grotesque truth about what happens when the pursuit of wealth devours everything human in its path. Getty didn't start rich. Born in 1892 in Minneapolis, his father was a struggling insurance lawyer who pivoted into the oil wildcatting business in Oklahoma. Young Paul watched his father strike it rich, then watched him work himself nearly to death protecting it. The lesson burned deep. Money wasn't just about comfort. It was about survival, control, and never being vulnerable again. At 23, Getty took a small stake from his father and went into the oil fields himself. Within 2 years, he'd made his first million. Most men would have celebrated. Getty saw it as confirmation of a darker principle. The world was a zero-sum game, and hesitation was the only real sin. He began acquiring oil leases across California with methodical aggression, buying when others panicked, selling when they got greedy. By his 30s, he was already wealthy beyond most people's comprehension. But wealth, for Getty, was never the destination. It was ammunition. His real empire building started after World War II. While other oilmen stuck to proven American fields, Getty looked at a map and saw something nobody else did. The Middle East wasn't just oil-rich. It was undervalued. In 1949, he secured a 60-year concession in the neutral zone between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. The established oil giants mocked him. They called it Getty's folly. Analysts said he'd overpaid for sand and political risk. What they missed was that Getty wasn't gambling. He'd done the geology. He knew what was underneath. When the drills hit pay in 1953, the wells gushed at rates that made Texas fields look like leaking faucets. Getty's neutral zone operations alone generated more revenue than entire countries. Fortune magazine declared him the richest living American. His net worth climbed past $1 billion, a figure so astronomical in the 1950s it barely registered as real. But here's what nobody understood at the time. Getty didn't experience wealth the way normal humans do. For him, every dollar was a soldier in an endless war he could never afford to lose. He lived like a man under siege. His estate, Sutton Place in England, was a 72-room Tudor mansion filled with priceless art. Tourists assumed it was paradise. The people who actually lived there knew better. Getty installed payphones in the hallways because he couldn't stand the idea of houseguests making free calls on his line. He'd walk through rooms turning off lights, muttering about electricity bills. Staff members were timed on their bathroom breaks. This wasn't eccentricity, it was pathology. His romantic life was a graveyard of wreckage. 5 marriages, all of them disasters. He'd marry women, grow bored or suspicious, then discard them with the same cold calculus he used to shut down unprofitable wells. His children grew up scattered across continents, raised by nannies and resentment. They learned early that their father's attention was a commodity more scarce than crude oil and far less reliable. George Getty II, his eldest son, spent his entire life trying to earn his father's respect. He worked in the family business, followed orders, stayed loyal. It didn't matter. Paul Getty saw his son as weak, too soft for the world's brutality. When George died of a stroke in 1973, Getty's response was chilling. He complained about the cost of the funeral. Not publicly, privately, to accountants. As if love could be itemized and grief had a price tag that wasn't worth paying. Then came the kidnapping. July 1973, Paul Getty III, his 16-year-old grandson vanished in Rome. A ransom note arrived demanding $17 million. The Italian police suspected a hoax at first. The boy had talked about faking his own kidnapping before, a desperate plea for attention from a family that had mastered the art of emotional absence. But this wasn't a game. The kidnappers were members of the Calabrian mafia, and they weren't bluffing. Getty's response made headlines around the world, but for all the wrong reasons. He refused to pay. His justification sounded almost reasonable at first. He had 14 grandchildren. If he paid for one kidnapping, he'd be inviting 13 more. It was a security argument, a tactical position. Except it wasn't really about security. Getty simply could not force himself to part with that much money, even to save his own blood. Weeks turned into months. The kidnappers grew impatient, then furious. They sent letters. They made threats. Getty's advisors begged him to negotiate. He wouldn't budge. The Italian authorities felt helpless. The boy's mother, Gail, was frantic, but she had no money of her own. Getty had made sure of that years earlier when his son divorced her. She was trapped, watching her son's life drain away while the richest man in America counted his coins. Then the package arrived. November 1973, delivered to a newspaper in Rome. Inside was a human ear, severed and preserved, along with a lock of red hair and a new message. The ransom was now $3.2 million. Pay it, or the next package would contain something worse. The photo they included showed Paul Getty III, gaunt and terrified, with the side of his head wrapped in bloody bandages. That's when the world saw who J. Paul Getty really was. Not a shrewd businessman making tough calls, not a grandfather protecting his family from future threats. Just a man so poisoned by his own wealth that he'd let his grandson be mutilated rather than write a check. The public outrage was immediate and savage. Newspapers called him a monster. Protesters gathered outside his estate. Even his remaining family members, the ones who'd spent decades making excuses for him, couldn't defend this. Getty finally agreed to pay, but only under conditions so petty they revealed the full depth of his sickness. He would pay $2.2 million, the maximum tax-deductible amount under Italian law. The remaining million would be a loan to his son, Paul Getty Jr., at 4% interest. His grandson's ransom wasn't a rescue. It was a financial transaction, structured for optimal tax efficiency. The kidnappers released the boy in December 1973. He was found shivering at a gas station in southern Italy, traumatized, partially deaf from infections in his wound, and permanently marked by what his family's dysfunction had cost him. Getty never apologized, never explained himself beyond the cold arithmetic he'd already offered. What happened next would prove that some prices can't be calculated in currency, and some debts compound in ways that balance sheets never capture. Paul Getty Jr. never recovered from what his father made him endure. The loan his son had to take with interest to save his own child broke something fundamental inside him. He retreated into heroin addiction, spending the next decade in a fog of self-destruction that money couldn't penetrate. His son, the boy who'd lost his ear, spiralized into drugs as well, suffering a stroke at 25 that left him paralyzed and nearly blind for the rest of his life. The Getty billions couldn't buy back what had been destroyed in those months of calculated cruelty. J. Paul Getty died in 1976, just 3 years after the kidnapping, alone in his Surrey mansion surrounded by art he never really looked at and wealth he never really enjoyed. The fortune he'd protected so viciously was worth approximately $6 billion in today's money. He left behind a family shattered into fragments, each piece reflecting a different facet of inherited trauma. The will itself read like a final act of control from beyond the grave. He left the bulk of his estate to the Getty Museum, ensuring his name would be carved into cultural history, whether he deserved it or not. His actual children received relatively modest trust distributions, carefully structured to maintain dependence. Even in death, he was still the miser counting coins, still the father withholding love, still the man who confused net worth with self-worth. What makes Getty's story so devastating isn't just the money he hoarded. It's the pattern he established, the template he created for how inherited wealth poisons families across generations. His descendants didn't just inherit his fortune, they inherited his sickness. Consider the tragedy that followed. Andrew Getty, his great-grandson, was found dead in 2015 at age 47, his body discovered in his bathroom amid evidence of long-term substance abuse. Another great-grandson, John Gilbert Getty, died in 2020 at 52, his death attributed to complications from a lifetime of addiction. The autopsy revealed a body destroyed by years of self-medication, a man trying to numb pain that money only amplified. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a disease that Getty himself had planted and carefully cultivated. He'd shown his family that love was transactional, that human worth could be calculated in spreadsheets, that emotional needs were weaknesses to be exploited. Then he'd given them infinite resources to act out those lessons in increasingly destructive ways. The psychological research on inherited wealth trauma has a term for this. They call it affluenza, though that word doesn't quite capture the specific poison Getty injected into his bloodline. His wasn't just about being spoiled or disconnected from reality. It was about learning that people, including yourself, are only valuable insofar as they generate or preserve capital. Getty's grandson Christopher once said something that cuts to the bone. "My grandfather was the richest man in America, and I never felt like I had a family." That sentence contains everything you need to understand about what Getty actually built. Not an empire, a vacuum, a cold space where human connection should have been, filled instead with lawyers, trusts, and tax strategies. The museum that bears his name opened in 1974, housing one of the world's finest art collections. Visitors walk through galleries filled with beauty Getty purchased, but never truly appreciated, surrounded by masterpieces he acquired because they were good investments or status symbols. The irony is almost too perfect. He spent a lifetime collecting objects meant to represent human creativity and emotion, yet remained utterly incapable of experiencing either. What's perhaps most chilling is how Getty's approach to wealth has been normalized, even celebrated in certain circles. Business schools still teach his negotiation tactics. Investment advisors cite his discipline as a model. Articles about his wealth-building strategies circulate on LinkedIn as if they contain wisdom worth emulating. But here's what those sanitized business case studies leave out. Getty's methods didn't create sustainable family wealth. They created a multi-generational catastrophe. Yes, the Getty fortune still exists in various trusts and foundations. The numbers on paper look impressive. But measure the actual human cost, tally up the destroyed lives, the addiction, the premature deaths, the relationships poisoned before they could even form, then calculate the real return on investment. The Getty family story reveals something uncomfortable about how we think about wealth in America. We've built an entire mythology around accumulation, around the virtue of building fortunes and passing them down. We celebrate dynastic wealth as if it represents some kind of achievement worth preserving across generations. Getty's legacy asks a question we'd rather not answer. What if that whole framework is fundamentally broken? Because here's the thing about money at Getty's scale. It stops being a tool and becomes a curse. It doesn't buy freedom. It creates new prisons, just more expensive ones. It doesn't strengthen family bonds. It replaces them with legal agreements and trust distributions. It doesn't provide security. It manufactures new and exotic forms of insecurity that people without money couldn't even imagine. Getty once said, "If you can count your money, you're not a billionaire." He meant it as a boast about his wealth being too vast to quantify. But it works better as an admission. He couldn't count his money because he'd lost the ability to measure anything that actually mattered. Human suffering didn't register on his internal calculator. Love had no exchange rate he could understand. The value of his grandson's ear couldn't be expressed in any currency he recognized. The final accounting of J. Paul Getty's life isn't found in his financial statements. It's written in hospital records, police reports, obituaries of descendants who died too young, and the silence of family members who learned that some subjects are too painful to discuss. He won the game of wealth accumulation so completely that it destroyed everything around him, including the very family that wealth was supposedly meant to benefit. There's a photograph of Getty taken shortly before his death. He's sitting in his study at Sutton Place, surrounded by priceless antiques, wearing a cardigan that's visibly worn and frayed. Even in his final days, he couldn't bring himself to buy a new sweater. In that image, you see the whole tragedy condensed into a single frame. The richest man in America, surrounded by treasures, wearing rags, completely alone. That's not the legacy of a successful life. That's a warning label we've chosen to ignore. Getty didn't build an empire worth inheriting. He built a monument to everything wealth becomes when it's severed from humanity. And somewhere in that cold mansion filled with beauty he couldn't feel, he proved that you can count every dollar and still end up with nothing at all. The Getty story isn't just about one man's greed. It's a blueprint of what we've decided to worship in this country. We build statues to accumulation. We write hagiographies about billionaires. We teach their tactics in universities as if ruthlessness is a skill worth learning rather than a sickness worth curing. But strip away the mythology, and what remains? A man who built an empire by hollowing out everything that makes life worth living, who proved you can win capitalism's game so thoroughly that the prize itself becomes meaningless, who demonstrated that some fortunes cost more than they'll ever be worth. His descendants are still paying that bill. The Getty name still opens doors, still commands respect in certain rooms. But walk through the actual wreckage of that family tree. Count the bodies, measure the pain, and then ask yourself what was actually won. Getty made his billion. He protected it viciously. He died alone in a house full of treasures he never enjoyed, leaving behind children who couldn't love him and grandchildren who couldn't escape him. That's not success. That's the most expensive failure in American history. And we're still teaching people to follow his example.